Okay, next up we have Unbound, a dark fantasy LitRPG Arcana Unlocked book number 1, written by Gregory Blackburn. It is 511 pages. It is $4.99. It's available on Kindle Limited, and here's the author's description. A game too good to be true, a golden opportunity, a nightmare he can't escape. If Arthur Mallory plays one more steaming pile of garbage disguised as a virtual role-playing game, he might hang up his gaming hat for good. When he discovers the new deep dive game, Worlds Unbound, he decides it might be worth a try. If it sucks, he'll just return it the next day and cancel the financing. The game is everything he could have wanted. Even without elves or dwarves or character creation, the magic system has him hooked. He's willing to overlook the mangled sleep schedule and crippling nightmares if it means feeling that the power running through his veins. It means feeling, anyways. But when an accident leaves his headset broken, he realizes he might be cut off from the magic and the game for good. He's not going to let that happen. Okay, that introduction feels a little skewed and it doesn't quite fit in perfectly with what actually comes out of the book. For the most part, it's accurate. This game, first of all, just didn't work for me. Parts of it were fine, but there were issues that it had, which I'll get into, that made it being entertaining for me. There's an RPG consistency in the story that LitRPG readers are going to enjoy if you're into that. But for me, there are messy story elements. There's a magic structure that have issues. And there are many times in the story where some of the game mechanics felt fudged. There's literally notifications that are into describing that I'm like, oh, that's an interesting choice. That feels like it exists to keep the story going, and not necessarily lining up with an actual mechanic. And because of those reasons, it left me not enjoying the novel overall. Again, there are good elements, but overall, it's like, nope, it doesn't work for me. Story-wise, this is supposed to be a virtual reality game story where the first full immersion game comes out and the main character happens to get the last copy at his local store for $75,000. I'm not really sure what that element has to do with it, to be honest. It doesn't really come up again in the story. Maybe it'll be a thing in the future for future novels, but for now it's just he has to pay $75,000 unless he returns it before the end of the trial period. So I'm like, okay. The main character plays the game, goes on a series of adventures, not as himself or as a character he creates, but as an existing character in the virtual reality world. This means that the main character has that person's full memories downloaded into his mind, and all the lore and all the world backstory that goes along with it, which I thought was an interesting choice. I didn't like it personally, but I acknowledge that it's the author's right to do so. For me, it became an info dump because anytime the main character needed to know something, he just kind of automatically knew it. He was like, oh, okay, that piece of lore, I know that. And he describes it to the reader, but it feels like unearned knowledge because it generally feels like the main character shouldn't know that. The character he inhibits shouldn't know that. And so it really just feels like, very often like, you make a lore roll and the DM describes something. And that's what it felt like a lot of times. But anyways, along the way, the main character suffers from several glitches, but cruises through several magic systems as he adventures and levels. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of the story. On its own, again, not a terrible story, but in several aspects ruined what could have been a very good exploration of either the RPG stuff or the story world. The most glaring aspect that I really didn't enjoy was the virtual reality aspect, oddly enough. It's not necessarily a bad setup on its own, but I don't think it's used well here. And I don't think it actually fits with the actual storytelling that happens. Worse, I think it kind of detracts from what could have been just a better fantasy RPG story. The virtual reality system, which on its face, again, doesn't really make sense, felt like it was there to justify why there are stats, why there are classes, why there are notifications, and add a weird side element of the main character being controlled in real life and being hurt by the game because of the memory downloads. But it's not an aspect of the story that really was really developed at all. Like that part of the story kind of took up like 10%, maybe 15 at the max, where the main character's in the world dealing with the consequences of any of that stuff. And it just felt like it's weird tangent. Like it's not really developed and it doesn't really go anywhere. I'm not really sure why it exists. And again, because it did exist, though, it did detract for what could have been, again, just a much better told, just fantasy RPG story. Why the main character has to like jump into this main character, this character in the world, instead of just having the story about that character. It is what it is. It just didn't work for me. Like, I kept thinking like, this is distracting. And I'll get on the whole, because the main character, again, took the role of that resident in this fantasy world. Again, I just would have been to hold without the virtual reality aspect. It would have let the main character learn about the world in a more natural way through investigations, through conversations, instead of the game mechanics and the world lore just kind of automatically being known by the main character without any work whatsoever. Another aspect of the story that kind of ruined what it could have been a good story was the messy exploration of magic and the fudge rolls made in the story. Now, initially, I was kind of pleased with the mix of class skills and the kind of the min-maxing aspect of what the main character chooses to do once he's once the character and he habits get access to the system. There's an unusual magic system that made me think the story is going to be like a thinking man's magic character. Instead, as the story progressed, it became obvious that the main character kind of had this 2-year-old's attention span for sticking to one kind of magic. He essentially goes from like, oh, this is a cool magic system, I'm going to use this a lot. And then it's like, oh, look, I can split off into this other magic system. And again, it happens like 4 or 5 times in the story, where he gets a new branch of magic and he just kind of swivels into that. And to me, it was such a wasted opportunity, because each one of those individually is kind of cool. They really are. But because there's not a lot of time spent with them, you kind of get to see them in a couple fights, and then there's a switch. And there's no real depth to each one of those. And so each one kind of feels very undeveloped. It feels like there's potentially cool things happening there, but you never really get to see them, because the main character is switching or advancing his magic in a way that kind of negates them. And to me, it's just kind of a wasted opportunity, because I would have really loved to see them all developed, maybe 1 per book instead of 4 or 5 per book. That's me. The story, while cool in some places, is again mostly slice of life, following a kind of a messy pattern of the main character leaping from questline to questline without much follow through, which made the story feel a little bit frenetic and messy. And for me, this is one of those things that really just bugged me. The game mechanics, they felt fudged. And that to me, I understand why authors do it. You don't want to kill your main character because you have a bad role necessarily. But they're just like, they're shown in the story where it's like, there's a mechanic in the story where the main character makes rolls for either knowledge checks or skill checks. And I generally like that showing of those skill checks, because it makes you like, oh, like the author's really rolling these dice to see if the character fails. And sometimes the main character fails, the author leaves it alone, or even makes a joke, which I'm perfectly happy with. What bothered me was when it says, oh, the character failed this roll, but he really succeeded because of outside circumstances or tier differences. And I'm like, so he failed the roll, but he really succeeded, so the story can continue, or he can get this information he needs. And I'm like, it happened a lot. And like that really bugged me, because it made the game elements feel less important. And I can understand that happening in like a tabletop game setting where, the dungeon master doesn't want to kill off, like wipe the entire group, or they need a piece of lore to, finish the quest or something. He might, fudge a roll, but he doesn't usually tell them. He doesn't usually say, oh, you failed that roll, but because it's really important, I'm going to just magically save you. He just has to succeed. And so it just felt weird to me to see the failure, but also say, oh, no, we're basically just making this up and saying it's a success for whatever reason. And so that bugged me. A super small gripe, which is not going to like bother most people, I think, is how the game mechanics, how the notifications were written in the story. They were underlined. And this meant that there were sometimes just like paragraphs of text in the story that was underlined entirely. And my brain did not like that at all. Like I really would have preferred a different formatting choice. And this is just again something that bugs my brain. I would have preferred rather than just, again, multiple paragraphs sometimes of just entirely underlined text, italics, it all in italics to show the game notifications, or brackets, or just a different font text to show that these are game notifications. That would have bothered my brain a lot less. But mind you, this is just formatting choices, not a huge deal. It doesn't really take up any points, but my brain, it bugged me, and it might bug other people, which is the only reason I'm mentioning it. So on the game mechanic side of things, the story was pretty good. The author goes out of his way to make things consistent, show lots of numbers on a fairly regular basis. There was lots of standard LitRPG stuff, classes, stats, item descriptions, quest notifications. Again, I generally like the element of showing roll checks for knowledge checks, spell successes, magical theory checks. I in general, I enjoy seeing those rolls because it makes it feel like, oh, this is actually, there's a chance that the character can fail. And when he fails spectacularly, there can be like weird consequences that change the course of the story. However, as I mentioned before, many of those rolls felt fudged. So that wasn't great. Let's see. Some of the magic stuff was really cool. But again, having so many transitions felt like they weren't really in depth. So there you go. Overall, while some of the story arcs in the novel are genuinely entertaining, there were just too many elements that made the story less enjoyable for me. It really felt like the novel was based on a custom tabletop game where the DM was kept trying to keep the players coming back after each session by switching storylines, opening up unique magic systems, and fudging rolls so that there were few failures, which didn't work for me as a reader, unfortunately. So for me, it gets a score 6 out of 10, which isn't a bad review score. It's just this doesn't work for me. If the issues I mentioned aren't the type of things that bother you, you probably enjoy this. And the novel really has a good number of good positive review scores. It's just that I can't be one of them because of the issues I mentioned. So for me, this is Unbound, a dark fantasy RPG with a score of 6 out of 10, which means that it just doesn't work for me.